absolutely delighted that Jonas is bringing his creativity to our research group. He's working on a master's project with us, exploring ways of about environmental processes. I will put that down there. Part of the reason for my nervousness today, as you can probably detect, is actually that we normally do this completely the other way around. We finish a project and then we engage with the users of our research. This meeting is happening halfway through a research project. Hopefully it's not halfway through of our research. It's the beginning of a rather different flavour of global environmental change research. That's been my field for 20-something years. And the longer I have been a biophysical scientist, the more I've been challenged by the question of how we deal with ourselves as human beings in this world that we're changing. So, again, I really thank you all for coming here and for being part of what is actually a series of conversations. We've got this open discussion this morning. This afternoon, some of us are going to be taking time to dig more deeply into the questions that we generate this morning. So part of the purpose of this morning's conversation is to provide us with questions that this diverse group of people can engage with. And then an even smaller group of us is disappearing off tomorrow for a couple of days of intensive arguing and writing, where we'll be trying to translate some of the issues that are presented now into rather better ways of communicating our research outwards. Many of you have sort of contacted many of us in the Planetary Boundaries research team asking for information. We haven't done a good job of distilling that information, and that's one of the purposes of this workshop that we've got coming up. This halfway point that we're in, talking with peers and, anyway. Can you hear me now? Bliss, okay. Back in 2009, I was really struck when the 2009 Rockstrom et al. Paper was published. Okay. Because it was a group of very interdisciplinary international scientists getting together and saying, rather than saying with more and more precision the state of their narrow science, they brought together physical climate change, ecological change, biogeochemical change, and tried to say, as a group of scientists, we need to make our best effort at saying we cannot continue on this trajectory anymore. It has been a concept that has grabbed people's attention for many ways. And since 2009, we've been working on improving various aspects of the different boundary processes. We've been trying to build a community that lets the next generation of conversations happen scientifically about how we link physics, chemistry, and biology, social sciences, economics, the whole profile of environmental studies. So there have been new scientific assessments, new advances. Every one of those has given a much clearer, sharper statement of the human impact on the global environment. And in many cases, they're calling very deliberately for action, to move away from scientific research, but challenging scientists and society together to make choices about action. And I'm just going to very quickly whiz through some of the really instrumental studies that have come out since 2009. Some of the most important ones related to physical climate. We've had a new international intergovernmental panel on climate change report in 2014 and also the climate COP just last year. And that tells us that climate is continuing to change, and the human imprint on climate can be detected and attributed, and that now means that there's a kind of transparency that means we can't ignore action anymore. There's been major biodiversity assessments. Some of them continue year by the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the rather depressing, okay, I've picked out a rather negative story there, but the Living Planet Index is a way of tracking organisms and populations of different species on Earth. That index continues to decline despite a decade or more of policy to protect ecosystems. The little signal there, the purple and red arrows, are the ones for protecting species that we already know are important. They're the species that we've identified as worthy of our protection. And we're either making no progress on species protection, or actually the situation is often worse than when we started. So, a call for action on biodiversity. There's been a global assessment of nutrient management and an in-depth assessment of nutrients in Europe. We don't yet have a global assessment of nutrients globally, but the human perturbation of that is very evident, and it's tightly tied into food security. So it's in our interest to translate knowledge to action. We have the same issue for land use, land cover change. Just now, in the next couple of weeks, the UN FAO will be publishing its latest global forest assessment. And again, even with 3 major multilateral agreements dealing in some way with forestry, climate, biodiversity, and anti-desertification, we're still seeing forest loss, and in areas where we aren't seeing forest loss, we're seeing forest degradation. They're not living forests, they're sticks and trees. So, again, in this report, we're seeing in rather formal contexts, stronger and clearer calls for action. I've also highlighted chemical pollution. We've got the problem there that as scientists, we can usually only detect the critical issues of chemical pollution once they've gone critical out there in the real world. We have information about how much money is transported around the world locked up in chemical forms, but actually the data, the raw information for us as scientists on chemical use, release, and the effects of multiple chemicals together is given that we're making these things, the lack of knowledge about their environmental pathways and their ecological fates is astonishingly shocking, and we don't really have an effective global chemicals outlook. The global chemicals outlook that I've reported there, the UNEP report, is the first real effort to talk about the increasing chemical intensity of our global economy. And it's, speaking as a scientist, it's still a very superficial analysis. People keep saying, why haven't you quantified a boundary for chemicals? We've got lots of data, but not the right data for that. But what we can say is the trajectory is going in the wrong direction, and if we want to monitor chemical processes and environmental releases of toxic, hazardous substances, then we need to do better on that. And looking on the much more optimistic side, we've had major social movement towards action as well. The Global Sustainable Development Goals have extraordinary international agreement that action needs to be taken. Same sort of thing with the climate COP. Action needs to be taken. For me, the sparkling element of the climate COP was the emphasis on social transparency of the climate process. We've been talking about mitigation for a long time. We've been talking about the need for adaptation and for financing and for the other dimensions that are included in the climate COP agreement. But the bit that I think enables action to happen is the emphasis on the transparency of the process. So by all means, go and look at climatetracker.org, and if you don't think your country's doing enough, add your voice to the list. So those things set the context for the conversation today. I often go back to the Brundtland Report's discussion of sustainable development because it deals with social and ecological resilience. It resonates very strongly with the way that we see our linked human-environment world. But the other bit I want to really highlight is that it doesn't reduce everything to a simple triple bottom line or, very simple statements of sustainability. It actually, although we often use a very simple definition, one sentence from the text, it actually specifies a much richer human responsibility for sustainability, including international discussions, including institutional change, including policy and economics and a whole range of other things. And that is why we've invited the panelists that we have today. They bring a very different perspective on the biophysical science that many people associate with our safe operating space research. We have 5 speakers to rattle through rather quickly this morning. So really, I ought to just briefly say who they are, actually. Kate Rayworth brings a perspective on social justice that I would really like to sort of bring into the discussion this morning. Gian Ometo from Brazil reminds us that the global really is global. Many people have critiqued the work of Rockstrom et al., the planetary boundaries concept, for being a white northern hemisphere perspective. But the science that we depend on is global science. And so I wanted the voice of the South to be heard in this conversation too. We have Katrin Zimmer, who commissioned some really interesting work on national responsibility for global unsustainability. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. We have Eva Karlsson talking about how we might use frameworks of global sustainability in real, everyday business choices. And then Josefina Skerk to talk a little bit about how we hold on to cultures and diversity and identity, even in the context of global change. So that's the flavor of this morning's discussions.